For more than half a century, Clint Eastwood has stood like a monument at the very center of American cinema. His face, his stare, his silence each became symbols of strength, resilience, and an unshakable spirit that generations came to admire. On screen, he was the cowboy who never missed, the lawman who never backed down, the director who turned simple stories into unforgettable legacies. Few men in Hollywood have carried such an aura, and even fewer have kept it alive for so long. To millions, Clint Eastwood is not only an actor or filmmaker, he is a cultural landmark, one of the last true giants of Hollywood's golden age. But legends, no matter how mighty, are never free from the shadows of their own lives. Behind the trophies and the applause lies a more fragile truth: choices that left deep scars, silences that lasted for decades, and family bonds that time itself could not repair. This is not just the tale of a movie star, it is the untold story of a father and a son, a story marked by absence and longing, by heartbreak carried in silence, and by a fragile late search for redemption. And perhaps, as we step inside this hidden chapter of Clint Eastwood's life, we will discover that even the strongest icons carry wounds far deeper than the roles they once played. Long before Clint Eastwood became the face of American toughness, he was just a boy trying to survive a world that seemed determined to break him. Born in 1930, at the very height of the Great Depression, his first cries came during a time when families across America were stripped of jobs, homes, and dignity. The Eastwoods were no different. His father drifted from one temporary job to another, uprooting the family so often that towns blurred together. Clint never stayed long enough in one place to call it home. That constant moving, the sense of never belonging anywhere, carved silence deep into his soul. He once said that silence became his oldest friend, and it's not hard to see why. When you are always the new kid, silence is the only thing you can carry with you without fear of losing it. But out of that rootless childhood came traits that would define his entire life: independence, endurance, a quiet resilience, born not of comfort, but of struggle. By the time Clint reached his teenage years, another storm swept across the globe. World War II. While many boys longed for stability and dreamed of ordinary futures, Clint already understood discipline and hard work. He pumped gas, logged timber, stacked hay jobs that calloused his hands, and hardened his spirit long before Hollywood ever noticed his face. Those early years of hunger, constant movement, and silence were more than just a childhood. They were the crucible that forged the man he would become, a man who would someday embody on screen the very strength he had been forced to learn in real life. By his early 20s, Clint Eastwood had already known hunger, uncertainty, and relentless work. But nothing prepared him for the day when survival itself became a fight against the ocean. Drafted into the U.S. Army, Clint trained as a swimming instructor, teaching others how to endure the water. Then, at just 21, fate tested him in the cruelest way. The military plane he was aboard lost power and went down into the icy Pacific. One moment, the roar of engines filled the sky. The next, he was crashing into endless waves, swallowed by salt water and fear. The freezing currents numbed his body instantly. Around him stretched nothing but horizon, no land, no rescue, just the vast silence of the sea. For hours, he swam, stroke after stroke, lungs burning, teeth clenched against despair. The thought of giving in, of letting the sea claim him, whispered with every wave. But Clint refused. "I just kept swimming," he would recall years later, in his famously understated way. But behind those words was a battle most men would not survive. In that endless night, Clint Eastwood learned the lesson that would define his life. Survival isn't about noise or panic. It is about calm, grit, and the quiet courage to endure. Each stroke was defiance, each breath a promise that he would not be erased. When he finally reached land, exhausted and trembling, he carried with him more than a narrow escape. He carried the knowledge that silence could be stronger than chaos. Decades later, when audiences watched him glare down villains without a word, when they saw him hold the screen with nothing but a pause and a stare, they weren't just watching an actor. They were seeing the young man who once swam through the Pacific, alone and unclaimed by fate, and lived to tell the story. Surviving the ocean gave Clint Eastwood a kind of inner steel, but Hollywood was a storm of a different kind. The town was merciless. Casting agents laughed at him, dismissing him as too tall, too stiff, with teeth too big for the camera. He wasn't the charming leading man studios wanted, and they told him so without hesitation. For many, Clint looked like the opposite of a star, awkward, unrefined, forgettable. But rejection only deepened his silence. Instead of begging for sympathy or giving up, Clint went back to work, real work. He hauled lumber in the forests, shoveled dirt, dug ditches under the hot California sun. He carried the weight of rejection the same way he carried wood on his back, silently, steadily, without complaint. Hollywood might not have wanted him, but life had already taught him how to fight without applause. In those early years, Clint took scraps of roles, uncredited parts, where his face flashed for a second and was gone. He stood on film sets not as a star, but as a laborer chasing the faintest trace of opportunity. Each humiliation, each no, became part of the foundation he was building. Unlike others who climbed quickly through connections, Clint's rise was slow, jagged, and often cruel. And yet, piece by piece, his grit began to show. He refused to bend to Hollywood's mold, refusing to change his height, his silence, his stare. What others mocked as weakness would one day become his greatest strength. His story was not one of privilege or charm, it was a story carved out of blood, sweat, and unshakable willpower. Every odd job, every closed door, every long night waiting for a call that never came, all of it was shaping the man who would someday redefine what a Hollywood leading man could be. Clint Eastwood was not simply climbing towards stardom, he was enduring a trial by fire that would make his eventual success feel inevitable, because nothing less than sheer determination could carry him through. After years of rejection and thankless roles, Clint's persistence finally cracked open a door. In 1959, he landed a part in the television series Rawhide. For 8 long years, America tuned in to see him as Rowdy Yates, a young cowboy whose words were few but whose presence carried weight. He didn't have to speak much. His sharp stare, his quiet strength did the talking for him. Week after week, viewers found themselves drawn not to dialogue, but to the silences that hung around him like a shadow. For the first time, Clint Eastwood was no longer invisible. But it was not until he crossed the Atlantic that his legend truly began. In Europe, Italian director Sergio Leone saw in Clint what Hollywood had dismissed. With a poncho draped across his shoulders, a cigar perched between his lips, and that unblinking glare that could freeze the screen, Clint became the man with no name. Leone's Dollars trilogy, A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly did more than make Clint a star. They rewrote the rules of cinema. Gone were the talkative, polished cowboys of Hollywood's past. Clint's gunslinger didn't need charm, didn't need speeches. Every pause was thunder. Every glance was a challenge. Every gunshot was myth. In that silence, audiences discovered a new kind of power, a hero who didn't win with words, but with presence, with grit, with a kind of quiet intensity that could silence an entire theater. By the time the trilogy ended, Clint Eastwood was no longer the struggling actor who had once been told he was too awkward. He had become something bigger, a global icon, a man whose face alone could carry an entire film. In Europe, he had transformed into the eternal cowboy, and when he returned to America, he carried with him not just fame, but a new definition of masculinity on screen, unyielding, mythic, unforgettable. By the 1972nd, Clint Eastwood was no longer just a star, he had become America's answer to chaos. The world was restless, torn apart by doubt, crime, and political disillusion. And into that atmosphere stepped Harry Callahan, the unflinching San Francisco cop at the heart of Dirty Harry. With a .44 Magnum in his hand and that famous glare, Clint embodied the kind of justice people longed for but no longer trusted in real life. Harry Callahan wasn't just a character, he was a mirror. He reflected America's fear of losing order, its anger at a system that seemed too soft, its hunger for a figure who stood firm when everyone else looked away. When Clint growled, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" audiences didn't just hear a line, they heard a challenge to the world's growing uncertainty. Through Dirty Harry and its sequels, Clint Eastwood wasn't acting so much as channeling the rage and exhaustion of an entire generation. He became the embodiment of toughness in an age when toughness felt like it was slipping away. His squint, his silence, his moral steel, they turned him into a phenomenon far larger than the movies themselves. But Clint wasn't satisfied being only the face of justice. He wanted more than the gun and the glare. In 1967, he founded Malpaso Productions, a bold act of rebellion against the Hollywood system that had once mocked him. With Malpaso, Clint no longer waited for permission. He chose his own stories, built his own films, and step by step, constructed his own legend, not just as an actor, but as a filmmaker in complete control of his destiny. This independence led to some of the most powerful films of his career. In 1992, Unforgiven dismantled the very myths of the cowboy that had made him famous, earning him 2 Academy Awards at 62. In 2004, Million Dollar Baby tore audiences apart with its devastating honesty, winning him 2 more Oscars at 74. With Mystic River, Letters from Iwo Jima, and American Sniper, Clint proved that his genius as a director wasn't in spectacle, but in truth raw, stripped, profoundly human. By the time the awards and honors piled up 4 Academy Awards, 4 Golden Globes, Lifetime Achievement honors from the American Film Institute, recognition from France and Italy, Clint Eastwood had become something almost mythic, yet he brushed accolades aside. To him, awards gathered dust. What mattered was the work. What mattered was endurance. While so many of his contemporaries faded, Clint adapted, creating decade after decade, refusing to stop. From the boy born into hunger, to the young soldier who swam for his life, to the actor who Hollywood once laughed at, Clint Eastwood had become more than a celebrity. He had become a monument, a living reminder that grit can outlast glamour, that silence can be more powerful than words, and that conviction, once forged in hardship, can endure a lifetime. By the height of his career, Clint Eastwood stood untouchable in Hollywood. He was the man who conquered television, reinvented the Western, redefined the American cop, and earned the respect of critics worldwide as a director. His films filled theaters, his face dominated posters, and his name carried the kind of weight reserved only for legends. To audiences, Clint was more than a star. He was a symbol of strength, endurance, and justice in a world that often felt unstable. But behind the red carpets, behind the Academy Awards and the thunderous applause, was another reality few dared to see. Away from the spotlight, Clint's personal life was tangled in contradictions. The same man who embodied order and clarity on screen lived a private life marked by fractured loves, secrets hidden in shadows, and family bonds stretched thin under the weight of betrayal and silence. This was the paradox of Clint Eastwood, the larger-than-life hero admired across the globe, and the man at home who struggled to hold together what mattered most. Each new film added to his legend, but each passing year also deepened the fractures within his private world. He had mastered the art of surviving rejection and shaping stories for millions, but within the walls of his own home, survival was more complicated. Hollywood saw only the triumphs, the Oscars, the acclaim, the immortal characters. What it didn't see were the children whose names he wouldn't acknowledge, the wives and partners who endured absences and betrayal, the silent wounds that fame could not mend. The glory was real, but so were the shadows. And as Clint's career soared higher, those shadows grew darker, weaving into the story that fame alone could never erase. Long before the posters, the Oscars, and the myth of Clint Eastwood, the legend, there was Clint, the young man, 23 years old, restless, uncertain, and searching for stability. In 1953, he found it, or thought he did, in Margaret Maggie Johnson, Unlike the glamorous women of Hollywood, Maggie was steady, elegant in a quiet way, and untouched by the chaos of the industry. To friends, their union seemed like the perfect beginning, the struggling dreamer with the devoted partner who would keep him grounded. For Clint, Maggie was more than a wife, she was an anchor in the storm of his early career. While he juggled odd jobs and fought to land even the smallest roles, she provided a home that felt safe, a reminder that no matter how uncertain Hollywood was, he wasn't completely alone. On the surface, it was the start of a classic love story, but even before vows were spoken, shadows had already crept in. Just months after their engagement, Clint strayed, and the consequence was devastating. A daughter, Lori, born of an affair, quietly given up for adoption. Her existence was hidden away, erased from public view. No red carpets, no father's name, no embrace. For Clint, it was a decision that would become a silent scar, a choice folded into secrecy that lingered across decades. Whether Maggie knew in those early days or discovered the truth later, the wound was undeniable. It wasn't only betrayal, it was a fracture of trust before the marriage had even begun. Still, she stayed. Through years when Clint was just another hopeful face in Hollywood, Maggie bore the role of steadfast partner. She was there when he landed Rawhide, when Sergio Leone's westerns turned him into an international star, when the world began to worship the man she had married in obscurity. Together they had 2 children, Kyle in 1968 and Allison in 1972. To outsiders, the Eastwoods looked complete. The rising actor, the faithful wife, the beautiful family. But behind the posed photographs, distance grew. Clint's absences stretched longer, his silences deepened, and Maggie, loyal yet weary, carried the marriage more on appearances than intimacy. The contradiction was painful. To Hollywood, Clint Eastwood was the image of strength, stability, and family values. To Maggie, he was a man already half lost to ambition, half swallowed by secrets. What was meant to be a foundation became instead the opening chapter of Clint's lifelong paradox, the myth of loyalty standing beside the reality of betrayal. If Clint's marriage to Maggie Johnson was the facade of stability, then his relationship with Roxanne Tunis revealed just how divided his world had already become. In 1959, on the set of Rawhide, Clint met Roxanne, a stuntwoman with piercing eyes and a quiet strength that seemed to understand him in ways others could not. She was part of Hollywood, yet not consumed by its vanity. To Clint, that made her irresistible. What began as a connection on set grew into something far deeper. Unlike the fleeting flings whispered about in studios, Roxanne's presence endured. For nearly 14 years, she remained by his side, not publicly, not with fanfare, but in the quiet spaces of his private life. All the while, Clint was still married to Maggie, playing the role of husband and father in one home while living another life entirely in the shadows. Hollywood insiders knew. Whispers circulated at parties, glances were exchanged on sets, but no one dared to shout it aloud. In the world of the industry, Clint's double life became one of those open secrets that people acknowledged silently but never printed. Roxanne wasn't a passing shadow. She was a steady flame that burned quietly, away from the flashbulbs. Their bond was sealed permanently in 1964 with the birth of a daughter, Kimber. She entered the world without cameras waiting, without the Eastwood name. Kimber was both a child of love and of secrecy, living proof of Clint's divided existence. For Roxanne, the years were lived half in light and half in darkness, cherishing the intimacy they shared, but aching with the knowledge that she would never be fully visible in Clint's public life. Looking back, their story paints a haunting portrait of Clint's duality. To the world, he was the rising star of Rawhide and soon the global face of the spaghetti western. To Roxanne, he was a man she loved deeply but could never claim entirely. Their daughter carried his features, his presence, his bloodline, but her existence was wrapped in silence, like a secret hidden inside the frame of a larger legend. It was the clearest proof of the paradox that would shadow Clint for the rest of his life. One man living 2 lives, endlessly divided between the myth celebrated on screen and the secrets he buried off it. Roxanne Tunis wasn't just another chapter in his personal life. She was the woman who revealed that behind the legend, Clint Eastwood was already caught in a web of choices that no applause could ever untangle. If Roxanne Tunis revealed Clint Eastwood's divided life, then Sandra Locke exposed the full paradox of his heart. In 1975, on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales, Clint met Sandra, an actress with delicate beauty but a fierce, unyielding spirit. Their connection was instant, magnetic, almost fated. For Sandra, it was nothing less than destiny. She believed she had finally found the one love strong enough to anchor her life, and Clint seemed to believe it too. For 14 years, they lived together, sharing homes, routines, and the illusion of permanence. To Sandra, Clint was not just a lover, he was her world. She once said with pride that Clint told her, "You made me monogamous." Those words, simple yet astonishing, became the cornerstone of her devotion. She repeated them in interviews and private conversations, almost like sacred vows. To her, they meant she was not just another woman orbiting a restless star. She was the one who had changed him, the one who finally made him whole. But reality was far harsher. While Sandra built her life around that promise, Clint quietly repeated the same pattern that had haunted his past. In the very years she believed she held his undivided love, he was fathering 2 children with Jacelyn Reeves, a woman Sandra didn't even know existed until much later. What Sandra thought was destiny became betrayal written in bloodlines. When the truth surfaced, it shattered her world. Sandra described the discovery as an earthquake, sudden, violent, devastating. Everything she had trusted for more than a decade crumbled in an instant. She had given Clint her loyalty, her youth, her belief in forever, only to learn that the man who swore fidelity had been living 2 lives all along. The aftermath was merciless. What began in passion ended in courtrooms. Sandra filed a palimony suit, then later a fraud suit, dragging their private war into the headlines. The woman who once glowed beside Clint now stood across from him, trembling with rage and heartbreak. In an interview, her voice cracked as she confessed, "I thought I had found the one person who would never hurt me. I was wrong." For Sandra, the loss was not just of love, but of a life she had built in faith. She had imagined growing old beside Clint, only to be handed ashes. For Clint, it was another chapter in a complicated legacy, just one more secret revealed. But for Sandra, it was a wound that never healed, one that defined the rest of her life. Looking back, their story feels less like gossip and more like a tragedy. Sandra Locke embodied Clint Eastwood's deepest contradiction, the man who seemed capable of absolute devotion, but who could never silence the restlessness that haunted him. To the world, Clint was the picture of strength and resolve. To Sandra, he was the man who promised eternity but delivered absence. If there was one love that revealed the fragility behind Clint's legend, it was this one. For 14 years, Sandra Locke believed she had touched eternity. Instead, she touched the sharp edge of silence, and it cut her open in ways no fame, no lawsuit, and no new beginning could ever mend. If Sandra Locke had been Clint Eastwood's great love turned tragedy, then Jacelyn Reeves was the secret that deepened those wounds beyond repair. She was not a Hollywood actress, not a woman chasing the limelight, but a flight attendant who entered Clint's orbit quietly in the 1982nd. To the outside world, she was invisible, almost ghost-like, yet behind closed doors, her presence would alter Clint's legacy forever. Their relationship was cloaked in silence. No red carpets, no public photographs, no interviews, only stolen hours and whispered meetings away from prying eyes. To many, it might have seemed like nothing more than a fleeting affair, but in truth, it became one of the most consequential chapters of Clint's private life, because in that silence, 2 children were born. In 1986, Jacelyn gave birth to a son, Scott. 2 years later, a daughter, Catherine, followed. These were not children hidden by circumstance or war, they were hidden by choice. And that choice was carved into the very first documents of their lives. On Scott's birth certificate, in the space where a father's name should have been written, there were only 2 words: "Father declined." Few phrases in the English language carry such cruelty. Not absent, not unknown. Declined. It was a rejection written in black ink, a verdict stamped onto his very identity. For Clint, perhaps it was a way to keep his life compartmentalized, to maintain the myth he had built so carefully. But for Scott, it was a wound that would shape his entire existence. To grow up knowing your father was not a mystery, or a man lost to tragedy but a living legend who chose silence instead of acknowledgement, was a burden few could imagine. Every headline that celebrated Clint, every award ceremony, every poster with the Eastwood name, was a reminder of what he had been denied. Through his childhood in Hawaii, Scott lived far from Hollywood's glow. He surfed, studied, and grew up with his mother by his side. Yet the absence of his father was a constant shadow. On Father's Day, classmates would proudly hand their cards to waiting dads, while Scott's remained folded, untouched. Nights in front of the television were filled with a different kind of pain, seeing his father on the screen, celebrated by millions, but unreachable to the boy who shared his blood. And Catherine, too, carried that same silent inheritance. Her life was marked by the paradox of being part of Clint Eastwood's legacy, yet growing up without his public acknowledgement. Together, the children of Jacelyn Reeves represented not scandal, but scars, the human cost of silence, the painful proof that even legends can fail in the most human of responsibilities. For Clint, the affair with Jacelyn may have seemed like another hidden chapter, tucked away behind the curtain of his fame. But for Scott and Catherine, it was the defining story of their lives. They weren't footnotes in a Hollywood biography, they were the embodiment of Clint Eastwood's greatest contradiction. A man who commanded entire worlds on screen, but struggled to stand present in the most intimate world of all his family. For Scott Eastwood, life began not with celebration but with denial. He was born in 1986, the son of one of the most recognizable men in the world, yet he carried the name Reeves, not Eastwood. His birth certificate didn't connect him to a Hollywood icon, it severed him from one. 2 words, "Father declined," became the silent inheritance he would carry into every stage of his life. Growing up in Hawaii, far from the flashing cameras of Los Angeles, Scott's childhood was a world away from the red carpets his father walked. The Pacific waves were his playground. His mother Jacelyn, his only constant companion. She raised him with quiet strength, trying to give him the stability Clint never offered. But no matter how much love she poured into his life, there were questions only a father could answer, and Clint was never there to answer them. At school, the absence cut the deepest. On Father's Day, when classmates proudly handed homemade cards to men waiting in driveways, Scott's cards remained folded, tucked away, with nowhere to go. During recess, when friends boasted about playing catch with their dads, Scott stayed silent. And on lonely nights, when he flicked through television channels only to stumble on the face of the man who looked just like him, the ache sharpened. Clint Eastwood wasn't an unknown figure, he was everywhere. On billboards, in movie theaters, in the hearts of millions. He was the hero to the world, but to Scott, he was a stranger. That paradox became Scott's shadow. To his classmates, it was a curious joke. "Are you related to Clint Eastwood?" they'd ask with playful smirks. Scott would shrug, force a smile, and change the subject. But inside, the question was unbearable, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew it too well. Yes, he was Clint's son. But no, he wasn't recognized as one. Silence defined him, just as it had once defined his father. But for Clint, silence was armor. For Scott, silence was suffocation. Each birthday without a call, each milestone without a father's presence, cut deeper than words could describe. The applause of millions for Clint's latest performance was like thunder rolling across an empty shore, reminding Scott of the one man who should have been there and wasn't. And yet, even in that absence, something else was being forged. Just as Clint's own childhood of rootlessness had hardened him, Scott's childhood of rejection planted in him a quiet defiance. He would one day turn the pain of being unwanted into fuel. But as a boy, he only knew the sting of being invisible to the man whose name the world revered. Before Scott Eastwood became a recognizable face on movie posters, he wasn't Eastwood at all. He was Scott Reeves, carrying his mother's name like both a shield and a burden. The famous surname that might have opened doors was the very name he refused to claim because he wanted no handouts, no whispers of nepotism. If he was going to succeed, it had to be on his own terms. But Hollywood didn't care about his quiet defiance. Casting directors weren't interested in his pedigree. To them, he was just another struggling young actor with too little experience and too many dreams. Rejection was constant. Scripts slipped through his fingers. Auditions ended with polite smiles and a quick, "We'll be in touch." The echoes of father decline seemed to follow him into every room, reminding him of the verdict life had stamped on him from birth. To pay his rent, Scott worked whatever jobs he could find: bussing tables, parking cars, pouring drinks late into the night, and even hauling lumber and working construction like his father once had. His hands blistered, his shoulders ached, and the mornings began with yet another audition where hope was always razor-thin. While other young men in Hollywood flaunted family connections or trust funds, Scott buried his bloodline, pretending it didn't matter, even as it quietly defined him. And then came the moment that cut the deepest. In 2014, Clint Eastwood directed American Sniper, a film destined for acclaim and box office triumph. For Scott, it felt like a chance not just for a role, but for recognition, for a bridge across the chasm that had divided him from his father his entire life. He auditioned with everything he had, pouring his hunger, his wounds, his unspoken questions into the role. But when the casting call ended, the verdict was the same as it had been on that birth certificate decades earlier. Number. The part went to someone else. To Scott, it wasn't just rejection, it was abandonment replayed, a cruel echo of the words that had haunted him since childhood. Not enough, not mine, not wanted. As Clint stood on stage accepting accolades for yet another triumph, Scott stood in the shadows applauding with the rest of the world, carrying a silence far heavier than the applause around him. Hollywood saw a brilliant director at the height of his powers. Scott saw his father choosing distance yet again. The rejection could have broken him, but instead, it hardened his resolve. Scott refused to let his life be a footnote in his father's story. If Clint Eastwood had built his legend out of silence, Scott would build his from scars. And each setback, each no, only sharpened his determination to make the world see him not as Clint's secret, but as his own man. If rejection and silence had been Scott Eastwood's constant companions, nothing could have prepared him for the kind of loss that leaves a scar deeper than any career setback. In 2014, just as he was fighting to carve out his place in Hollywood, Scott's world shattered in an instant. Jewel Brangman, the woman he loved, was taken from him in a horrific car accident caused by a defective airbag. One day, she was his anchor, the person who believed in him, not as Clint Eastwood's son, but simply as Scott. The next, she was gone. The phone call came like a blade, cutting his life into two parts, before and after. No warning, no goodbye, only a silence heavier than any he had ever known. Scott later admitted that Jewel's death haunted him every single day. She was the one who had seen him beyond his father's shadow, the one who treated him not as a secret or a symbol, but as a man worthy of love. To lose her in such a senseless way was more than heartbreak. It was devastation that seeped into every corner of his life. The image is unbearable. Scott, already carrying the wound of a father who would not claim him, now standing at the graveside of the woman who had claimed his heart so completely. No red carpet, no applause, no rising career could mend that fracture. Hollywood may have seen another young actor chasing roles, but privately Scott was broken, struggling to breathe through a grief that had no script, no resolution. In interviews years later, his voice would tighten as he spoke of her, proof that the wound never truly closed. For a man who had grown up in silence, Jewel had been a rare moment of warmth, proof that love could cut through rejection. Her absence left him not only with loneliness, but with a cruel reminder that life could take away even the little that remained. Scott carried on, but he carried her ghost with him. The weight of her absence joined the weight of his father's silence, stacking grief upon grief. And yet, through that unbearable pain, he did not collapse. Instead, as he had done all his life, he moved forward not because it was easy, but because stopping meant surrender. Out of the ashes of grief, Scott Eastwood refused to disappear. Jewel's death could have broken him, just as years of rejection might have sent him running from Hollywood forever. But instead, he chose to keep moving forward, step by painful step, as if proving to himself, and perhaps to his father, that he could not be erased. He started small, taking roles that barely registered in the public eye. He auditioned relentlessly, sometimes landing parts, often walking away empty-handed. Each success was hard-won, carved out not through family connections but through the same kind of relentless endurance his father had once shown. There were no shortcuts, no favors, only hours of work, and the determination to outlast the no's. Gradually, his persistence began to pay off. In Flags of Our Fathers, he stepped into a story of sacrifice and resilience, echoing themes that had shaped his own life. Later came The Longest Ride, where audiences saw not just a handsome young actor, but someone carrying a depth that couldn't be faked. In Suicide Squad and Pacific Rim, Uprising, Scott proved he could hold his own in blockbuster spectacle, standing alongside established stars without fading into the background. But behind each role was something far more important than screen time. It was survival. Every time Scott walked onto a set, it wasn't just about acting. It was about proving that he was more than the boy stamped with "Father Declined," more than the son who had once been invisible. He was showing the world, and himself, that his scars could become his strength. Even as his career blossomed, the wounds never fully closed. At premieres, the Eastwood name printed on posters was both a crown and a chain, a reminder of the bloodline that made people curious, and the silence that had once denied him that very name. On Father's Days, even when surrounded by friends and colleagues, the empty chair remained, an echo of the absence that no success could fill. Still, Scott pressed forward, choosing not to let grief or rejection define the entirety of his story. Instead, he built momentum roll by roll, paycheck by paycheck, brick by brick. If Clint Eastwood's legend had been forged in silence, then Scott's was being forged in fire, the fire of loss, of rejection, of perseverance. And each time the cameras rolled, audiences weren't just watching another Hollywood actor. They were watching a man who had endured storms most couldn't imagine, and who still stood tall in spite of them. For decades, the word between Clint Eastwood and his son Scott had been silence. Silence on a birth certificate, silence on birthdays, silence through childhood and into adulthood. Yet slowly, as Scott built a name for himself, rare moments began to surface where father and son appeared side by side. To the public, these moments looked triumphant, a son finally standing in the light of his legendary father. But to Scott, they were far more complicated. There was no Hollywood reconciliation, no tearful embrace before flashing cameras. Clint never stood at a podium and spoke of regrets, never gave speeches of acknowledgement. What existed instead were quiet appearances. A red carpet where they posed shoulder to shoulder, an interview where Clint allowed Scott to stand next to him, photographs where the resemblance was undeniable, yet the space between them still lingered. For Scott, every one of those appearances was both victory and reminder. Victory, because the man who had once refused to sign his name on a birth certificate was now letting him share a stage, a camera frame, a sliver of legacy. Reminder, because no photograph could erase the years of silence, the birthdays missed, the milestones overlooked, the ache of a father who had been absent when it mattered most. Observers saw two Eastwoods, the passing of a torch from father to son. But Scott felt the weight of paradox. Standing beside Clint wasn't simply about pride. It was about enduring the haunting knowledge of all that had been lost in the decades before. The distance was there in their eyes, in the stiff way they posed together, in the unspoken words that hovered between them like ghosts. And yet, even in that distance, there was survival. Scott had endured rejection, loss, and the long shadow of being unwanted, and now, standing beside Clint, he was no longer invisible. He wasn't just the boy once stamped, "Father declined." He was Scott Eastwood, a man forged by scars, now visible to the very world that had once ignored him. For Clint, those appearances may have been his only way of speaking the words he could never bring himself to say aloud, "You are mine." And for Scott, simply being there was an act of defiance, proof that he had not been erased. Together, their presence told a story Hollywood could never script. Not closure, not reconciliation, but coexistence. A fragile, imperfect acknowledgement that sometimes survival itself is the closest thing to peace a family can find. By the time Clint Eastwood reached his 82nd, he was no longer the fiery young star who had stormed Hollywood's frontier. He was an aging monument, weathered by decades of triumph and scandal, carrying the weight of silence, regret, and loss. Many of his contemporaries were already gone, their names etched into memory. Clint, still standing, seemed eternal, but even monuments grow weary. And in those twilight years, when the applause grew quieter and the cameras less frequent, fate led him to someone unexpected, Christina Sandera. Christina was no celebrity. She wasn't a starlet chasing fame or a Hollywood insider. She was a restaurant hostess at Clint's own Mission Ranch Hotel in Carmel. To everyone else, she was ordinary, almost invisible. But to Clint, she was salvation. For the first time in decades, he discovered a love stripped of pretense, free from the chaos of industry gossip or the demands of Hollywood. With Christina, he wasn't an icon, a director, or a myth. He was simply a man, and for once, he was enough. Their life together was quiet, tender, deeply human. In the mornings, they shared coffee on the porch, gazing out at the rolling hills, talking about nothing and everything. In the evenings, they walked arm in arm through the ranch, a slow rhythm of companionship that felt more precious than any award or honor Clint had ever received. She brought laughter back into rooms that had long echoed with emptiness. She softened his famously guarded demeanor, replacing his squinting glare with genuine smiles, smiles not for cameras, but for her. Friends noticed the change immediately. They spoke of how Clint seemed lighter, freer, even joyful in ways they hadn't seen before. For a man who had spent most of his life restless, divided, and haunted by silence, Christina was home. She gave him something he had been denied all his life: roots. For the boy who had grown up moving from town to town, for the man who had lived in two worlds at once, this was the first time he truly belonged. And then, just as fate had so often done in Clint's life, it struck with merciless cruelty. In 2024, Christina passed away suddenly. In an instant, the fragile peace Clint had finally found collapsed. At 94, he was left alone once more, surrounded not by applause but by silence, the silence of loss, heavier than any he had carried before. At Mission Ranch, her absence was everywhere. The chair where Christina once sat at breakfast remained empty. The porch where they shared coffee now overlooked only shadows. Evenings that had ended with laughter now faded into hollow quiet. For a man who had endured rejection, betrayal, and heartbreak, this was the deepest wound of all, because it struck not in youth, when there is still time to rebuild, but in the fragile twilight of old age, when there are no second chances. Christina had been his last love, his final companion, proof that even legends deserve tenderness. And when she was gone, Clint was left not with scandal, not with headlines, but with the cruelest absence of all, the silence of a house once filled with love, now echoing with memory. After Christina's sudden passing in 2024, Clint Eastwood found himself in a silence more unbearable than any he had ever known. The man who had spent his career embodying toughness, who had stared down villains without blinking, now faced an emptiness that no role, no script, no legend could shield him from. At 94, there were no more reinventions, No more new beginnings waiting just around the corner. The applause had faded. The crowds moved on, and the rooms of his home echoed with the absence of the woman who had been his final anchor. And yet, into that silence, stepped someone he had once left in silence himself. Scott, the son whose birth certificate had carried the cruel words "father declined." The boy who had grown up watching his father from afar, aching for acknowledgement that never came. Now a man hardened by rejection, grief, and perseverance, Scott walked back into Clint's life, not as the wounded child he once was, but as a presence steady enough to stand beside his aging father. There were no grand reconciliations, no Hollywood speeches of regret, no cameras waiting for a staged embrace. Their connection was built differently, stitched quietly, moment by moment. A shared glance during an interview, a rare appearance together at a premiere, a photograph of father and son, standing shoulder to shoulder, the distance between them both visible and unspoken. For Clint, allowing Scott into his world in these final years was its own kind of confession. He would never say the words outright. Apologies and regrets were not in his vocabulary, but in the way he permitted his son to stand beside him, there was an acknowledgement deeper than language. "You are mine. I see you now." For Scott, every handshake, every red carpet photo, every moment in his father's presence was layered with contradiction. It was victory proof that he had broken through decades of denial and silence. But it was also a reminder of birthdays missed, of the young boy who had stared at a television screen, wishing for a father who never came. Standing next to Clint in public, Scott carried both pride and grief, triumph and ache. Observers often mistook these appearances as a happy ending, a perfect reconciliation. But the truth was far more complex. What father and son shared was not forgiveness tied up neatly with words. It was coexistence. It was presence. And in that fragile presence, in those fleeting moments of togetherness, lay the closest thing to peace they would ever find. In the twilight of his years, Clint Eastwood no longer looked untouchable. His weathered face carried lines etched by both triumph and regret. Beside him, Scott stood as living proof of resilience, a man who refused to vanish, who bore scars but still chose to be there. Together, they formed not the fairy tale image of reconciliation, but something far more real. A father and son, imperfect and incomplete, finally sharing the same frame. By the time Clint Eastwood reached his mid-92nd, his place in cinema was unquestionable. He was not only a star but a director of rare power, a man who had spanned generations, shaping the way the world imagined toughness, justice, and resilience. His films filled shelves with trophies: 4 Academy Awards, 4 Golden Globes, lifetime honors from the American Film Institute, tributes from France and Italy. To the public, his legend was secured in gold. But for Clint, awards had always been secondary. He often brushed them aside with a shrug, knowing that statues gather dust while stories endure. What mattered most to him was the work, the endless drive to create, to keep pushing, even as his body slowed and time pressed heavier on his shoulders. While many of his contemporaries faded into obscurity, Clint adapted, kept building, kept telling stories that mattered. His survival in Hollywood was not about glamour but about endurance. And yet, when we peel back the layers of recognition, the true legacy of Clint Eastwood is not found in trophies or box office records. It lies in the paradox of his life, the man who could embody the strongest heroes on screen, but who stumbled again and again in the quiet realm of family. For every standing ovation, there was a silence at home. For every role that cemented him as a symbol of justice, there were children left in shadows, loves fractured by betrayal, wounds that even time could not mend. This contradiction is what makes his story more human and perhaps more enduring. Clint Eastwood was never just the mythic cowboy or the uncompromising cop. He was also the man who carried regrets he rarely voiced, who lived divided between the man the world adored and the father many of his children longed to know. His legacy, then, is not a clean narrative of perfection, but a reminder that greatness does not erase imperfection. And maybe that is why he resonates so deeply. We admire his strength, but we also recognize his flaws. We see a man who reached the heights of glory, yet still wrestled with loneliness and silence. His story tells us that even legends are fragile, that even monuments crack. What endures is not the myth alone, but the humanity inside it, the reminder that triumph and heartbreak often walk hand in hand. Clint Eastwood's story, when seen in its entirety, is more than a timeline of box office triumphs and golden statues. It is the story of a man who towered above cinema, reshaping the image of toughness and silence, yet who also stumbled in the most human of ways. He was the cowboy who never missed, the cop who never blinked, the director who could strip away illusions until only raw truth remained. But off-screen, he was also a father who faltered, a lover who betrayed, a man who carried regrets like shadows he rarely named. And that paradox, strength and fragility, triumph and silence is what makes his legacy so haunting. The myth of Clint Eastwood will always live in film reels and cultural memory. But the man behind the myth reminds us of something even more profound, that greatness never erases imperfection, that even legends are marked by loneliness, by loss, by the unspoken scars of family left behind. Scott's presence in these final years is proof of this truth. It is not the storybook reconciliation Hollywood loves to script. There were no dramatic apologies, no sweeping declarations of love between father and son. What they shared was quieter, subtler, stitched together through small moments, a handshake, a glance, a shared silence that finally carried acknowledgement instead of denial. For Clint, those moments were perhaps his way of saying what he could not say aloud. For Scott, standing beside his father was not forgiveness, but resilience, a choice to be present despite the scars. And in that fragile bond lies the essence of Clint Eastwood's true ending, not the closing scene of a Western gunfight, not the roar of applause after another masterpiece, but something simpler, a man in the twilight of life, weathered by time, finally standing with his son, both scarred, both imperfect, both still enduring. When history remembers Clint Eastwood, it will recall the glare, the squint, the characters larger than life, but those who look closer will see more the hunger of a boy shaped by the Great Depression, the silence of a soldier swimming for survival, the contradictions of a father who stumbled, and the fragile peace of an old man who, in his final years, allowed love back into his home. And that may be his most powerful legacy of all, because in the end, Clint Eastwood reminds us of a truth bigger than cinema itself, that even the greatest legends are human, longing not to be remembered for perfection, but for love.